everyone, and thank you for being here. This is the TreeStuff Educational Webinar Series. I'm Jake Miller. Well, tonight's webinar, how to care for trees in hot weather. And I don't need to tell you that it is hot outside and many parts of the country are dry. This is the U.S. Drought Monitor. Look at the difference between July 23rd and August 20th, a little less than a month apart. You can see parts of the country are experiencing abnormally dry conditions, moderate drought, severe drought, and extreme drought in southern Texas. Well, as you know, trees have an incredible line of defense against the scorching sun and even a lack of water, but sometimes they need the help of a professional arborist to get them through some very tough conditions. And that's where our man, ISA Certified Arborist Albert Cooper comes in. Albert's going to discuss treating trees in hot weather. And he's also going to talk about drought stress, leaf scorch, and how to identify an affected tree and best treatment practices. So get your questions ready for Albert. He's going to be answering them throughout the webinar. And don't forget, we're going to be offering 2 ISA CEUs through our quiz. We'll have posted a link to that after the webinar has concluded. So let's get things going and pass it over to Albert. Albert, thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks so much, Jake. My name is Albert Cooper, and my background's in floriculture and horticulture. And today we're going to do a little webinar on summer stress, drought, and how that all affects trees. And I hope you guys get something out of this. Well, we will be taking questions as we go through. If you just want to type them into the comments, Kale will get them to me, and we'll make sure to answer this as we go through. And then we'll also have a break about halfway through for more questions, as well as at the end. So certainly don't be shy about stopping me if you have a question about what we're talking about. But if we'll just jump right into the overview here. Okay. Get the PowerPoint coming up here. Sorry, here we go. Had a little technical difficulty there. All right, so today what we want to cover is what does water do, both in the soil and the tree, the atmosphere, and the world around us. We're going to go over the plant structures, how the plant moves water through the tree, and what's responsible for that. There's some pretty interesting stuff there. How have the right plant for the right place is important. I know we cover this every time we talk about trees, but you can never have too much. We're also going to cover fertilization in the summer and the do's and don'ts of that, as well as how trees respond to stress. Then we'll go over and have a recap of this and answer any questions you have. All right, jumping right into what does water do here. So there's a lot of things that water does that's pretty important, but before we can talk about drought, we have to talk about a couple other things first. Why do plants need water? How it moves in the soil? How it's used? And to be very honest, if we just talked about how to combat drought stress, it'd be pretty short. If it's dry, we just need to add water to it. So the main thing that water does in a plant is it provides relief from heat stress. It's kind of hard to believe, but 97% of the water that a tree will use will be used exclusively for transpiration. And so that's just keeping the plant cool and hardly anything else. About 2% of the water it uses is actually for transporting things throughout the tree. Obviously, we need to have a way to get nutrients from the soil to the leaves and the structures, and from the sugars and energy that the leaves produce back down to the parts of the plants that need to use it. So we all know that trees absorb minerals through the roots and send it other places, and this is, water is what we use for the highway to make this happen. But when we think about transportation and transport of minerals, we think about osmosis and how water moves across membranes, but we really need to be thinking about diffusion. And diffusion, all that is just moving from high areas of high concentration to low concentration. Water also aids in moving the opposite way. You know, when we have soil, we have more nutrients in the plant than we do in the soil, and so we have to somehow overcome this to continue to get nutrients into the tree, and water helps in that process, which is, you know, active transpiration or active transport, where it's moving against the gradient. It also provides a lot of structure, and so when we think about structure and cells, just to review a little bit on the high school biology of this, you know, plants have a cell wall which remains rigid even if it was empty, and then inside we have a cell membrane, which is basically the sac that holds everything together in the plant. And so when we have water, you know, in these cells, it's called turgor pressure, and so this allows cells to be stiff and rigid, and would give non-woody plants almost all of their support. But in woody plants like trees, we really only see this turgidity, this turgor pressure in the leaves and the soft tissues. The wood, because there's lignin in it, it remains stiff even when dry. You know, that's why we have firewood and all of that. When we have reduced turgor pressure, obviously we're going to have sagging and bowing and, in general, wilting. That's what wilting is a lack of turgor pressure. But, you know, when we're talking about the cell wall and the cell membrane, that has a pretty special relationship, where plasmolysis is essentially what happens when we experience drought stress. So what it is the plant dehydrates and the cell membrane pulls away, shrinks from the cell wall, and that's wilting. But if it ever dehydrates enough that the cell membrane separates completely from the cell wall, then the cell dies. So when a cell dies, that's what's happening. The cell membrane is completely separated from the cell wall, and that process is called plasmolysis. And there's no coming back from that. Even if you give it all the water you can, the cell is unable to reattach that bond. In addition to those, which are all fairly self-evident, the photosynthesis is probably the most critical piece that water is a part of. In photosynthesis, it requires water we split the hydrogen and oxygen bonds, and that gives us the ability to create more energy. So this is all done in the chloroplasts, but it's all driven by water. And the cool thing about photosynthesis is that there's 3 different kinds. Every plant does photosynthesis, but they don't all do it the same way. And so this is kind of a cool thing. There's the 3 types are C3, C4, and CAM. And so C3 is where we see a lot of drought stress, because the way that it works, it's the most efficient way to have photosynthesis occur, but it's a bell curve. It goes, you know, as the temperature increases, we get more and more photosynthetic activity until we hit, you know, about 85 degrees, and then it plateaus out. And no matter how much more sun or air or water we get, we're not making any more energy from this type of photosynthesis. And it's called C3 because in the mid process of it, it creates a 3-carbon bond. So this is most of your deciduous trees, anything that you really see with a lot of drought stress happening to it. This is why. This is one of the ways that it combats this. But so what we're going to talk about later is the right place for the right tree, and making sure that we're picking the right things so we can get ahead of the drought stress. Some things that we could do to do that is identify what plants do the next type of photosynthesis, which is C4. that, so named because it produces 4 carbons instead of 3. Instead, and it is not as efficient as C3, but it doesn't experience the same slowdown in the higher temperatures. It can go as high as 105 before it starts plateauing off and not producing any more energy. So this is, anything that's really adapted to hot and dry climates, that's what will have C4. Same thing with grasses and anything that's not a desert plant, we classically think of as a succulent, but is still what you'll find in the South. And so then the last way is CAM, which is a completely different way to do photosynthetic or have photosynthetic activity happen, but it's suited just for the desert. And so the way it works is, instead of the other two, which convert photosynthetic activity as it happens during the day the whole time until it hits the peak temperature, what CAM does is it does half of it during the day and the other half at night. So it basically splits all the water all day and then turns it into, converts all the carbon molecules in the evening. And that is predominantly in succulents, things that are in the desert, and that really helps out with them because it has no temperature cap. And even though it's not as efficient as the other two, the fact that it's not limited by heat allows it to continue on for as hot as it gets. But we'll move on to the next slide here. So once we understand that water is the lifeblood here of the tree, we need to understand how it gets from the ground up into these massive trees and how that all moves. And the best place to start is the beginning. So when we think about that, we need to be thinking about roots and root hairs and all of that. So if you watch the proper planting webinar we did this spring, this will all be reviewed, but if you haven't, then this will be good new information for you. Root hairs are predominantly for increasing surface area of the roots. And what they are is they're just lateral offshoots of the roots that are responsible for almost all of the absorption of the roots. So all the water, all the minerals, all the nutrients that come into the roots are really being taken up by these really fine root hairs. And we're talking, dozens of cells, not necessarily something you could easily dig in the ground and find. Because they are so small, they're extremely easy to be damaged, whether that be through compaction or salt damage or drought. These things the root hairs will die, and then that reduces the amount of absorption power that the tree has. And all of this is really held in the, when we talk about the root zone, we're talking about the top 12 to 18 inches of the soil, and that's where all of the active roots are. Obviously, we have roots deeper than that, and used more for structure than it is for absorption, although they do that as well. But all the roots that are doing this, they're extending well past the drip line. So when we think about making sure that we're getting enough water to the tree, or if the tree is able to provide for itself, we also need to consider the root zone. And if we're in an urban situation, do we even have enough soil volume to make this happen for this tree? Yep, absolutely. So once we get the roots going, where does the water go? So we have the xylem. It goes directly from the roots into the xylem, and everyone, I'm sure, had high school. I'm sorry, we got some technical glitch here, but we had some. The xylem goes up the tree, and it's on the outside of the tree, and we always think of it as sprouts, but it's actually one of the coolest pieces of the tree, because the way that it works and how it transports water is very unique. Everything has a price, right? Everything costs something, whether it be energy or money. But water transport through the tree is a odd exception, because the plants have devised a way to take water from the soil, move it up hundreds of feet into the air and into the atmosphere without expending any energy. The way that it works is capillary action and negative water potential. And so basically, what that is water is, it's always called the Mickey Mouse molecule, because you have the hydrogen and the two hydrogens and the oxygen molecule make it look like a Mickey Mouse, but it has a positive and negative charge to it, and so it attracts to itself. And so basically, when you have these small straws, if we think about the xylem as a long piece of rope, at the leaf, when water evaporates, it pulls the electric charge pulls up the next molecule. And that's just it's diffusion and osmosis that's doing that. So the plant doesn't need to expend any energy to do that. It's also aided by capillary movement, which is basically, if you had a straw in a drink, whenever you drink out of it, you notice that the straw has a little higher level of liquid in it than the rest of the drink. And so it's the liquid that went up the straw is being pulled up through surface tension, and that also is it's being backfilled by that capillary action and the attraction of water to itself. So the cool thing is that this is all energy free. So as water gets pumped up this tree, we're losing some to the evaporation, and then we're pulling more up. But the reason that it's even moving this way in the beginning is negative water potential, which is basically there's less water in the air than there is in the soil, and so this is just the natural desire to be equal. And so water moves out of the soil through the xylem up the tree and into the air in an effort to reach equilibrium. And so there's formulas for water potential. There are negative water potential, which factor in the gravitational force and how dry it is in the air versus how dry it is in the soil, and all of that is intellectually interesting. But for our purposes, we don't need to get into any of that. My soil professor in college always would make terrible puns about how dry soil is as a topic, and he's not wrong. So we'll try and keep it high level here. Because water's moving in the tree and just responding to the natural forces, and there's no energy that needs to be created to make this happen. And when we're thinking about this, the xylem, just to touch on it, xylem's primary flow is up. There are some cases where it's not that way, but 99% of the time, water is flowing up the xylem, and its counterpart, phloem, is flowing down in the opposite direction. And phloem is responsible for the transportation of nutrients and assorted minerals that need to be distributed to the rest of the tree. We're making all the energy in the leaves primarily, and it needs to be redistributed. And so that is basically a water flow tube that takes it where it needs to go. We're talking about 97% of the water that trees use is for transpiration. The interesting thing about this is when we talk about tree injection, we have to be really cognizant of what formulations we use for the pesticides and fungicides, because unlike a spray where it's a dry environment, when we inject pesticides into a tree, we're essentially putting it inside a column of water. And so if there's any negative reactions having that much water, then we need to be aware of that before we go. Now, the interesting thing about xylem and phloem is that even though when we learn about it, we always learn about it just like that. It's a set of straws and that's it. Deciduous trees and coniferous trees have very different structures to them. When deciduous trees have xylem, it's exactly what we think of. It's a straw, and it goes up to the top of the tree, and that's pretty much it. And that's called primary xylem. But conifers have a cool thing where they'll produce secondary xylem. And so what that ends up looking like is, instead of a bundle of straws, it's a big stack of Legos with holes in the top and the bottom. So you have 2 bricks, and the water has to fill one brick all the way up before it can get into the next one and fill that up. So water moves a lot more slowly through a conifer than it would through a deciduous tree. And so the primary is the outside, and then the secondary is the inside. But because water moves more slowly through the tree, conifers also often have specialized techniques to reduce the amount of water that's lost to the environment. Some of these things that they use are the shape of their leaves. When we think about deciduous trees, we think about big, wide leaves, very lush and soft. And when we think about conifers, oftentimes they'll have needle or scale type leaves or saber type leaves. And this offers a much smaller profile for the sun and the wind to act on it, reducing evaporation, and thus reducing water requirement. They'll also have on the leaf waxy buildup, which keeps moisture in as a waterproof barrier. And you usually only see this on conifers, but not always. Obviously, trees that are more suited for the south and the hotter temperatures, live oaks have a very thick waxy layer on them. A couple others. And then also they'll have a very wide cuticle, which is the outside layer of the leaf. And so that, again, reduces the amount of water that's being transpired out of the plant and conserving the water that's staying in. The reason it's important to conserve water and not have to have dehydration go on, obviously, is without water we can't do any of the things we just talked about or do photosynthesis. But it also, when we dehydrate, it closes the stomata. And there's hundreds or thousands of tons of stomata on every leaf. And so what it is there are little holes that essentially let water out of the tree, but it also is responsible for the intake of CO2, which is another critical component of photosynthesis. So when trees dehydrate and the stomata close, so if we look at the picture of the green picture of the stomata here, on the left, the cells are turgid, full of water, and so they're banana shaped and stay open. So water can get out, CO2 can get in, and that's the optimum way to produce energy and have the tree continue on living. When they dehydrate, they close together because the turgor pressure in the cells is less, so they collapse on each other, and that prevents more water from getting out. They seal up. But it also prevents CO2 from getting in a meaningful way. And so when we have dehydration or drought stress and the stomata close, we're not creating energy for the tree. So that it's important to try and stay as hydrated as you can as a tree. So those are the main players in plant structure. If we'll go to the next slide. So that's the main players, how the structures of how water gets where it's going and how it happens. But before, whether it's a drink or a tree, the source of the liquid, where we're getting it from, plays almost as big a role as what we do with it once we get it. In the case of trees, obviously soil. And we talked a little bit about this maybe 2 years ago on a webinar on pesticides and soil texture. But soil texture actually plays a lot more into drought stress than you might think. So when we think about soil texture, what we're really talking about is three different sizes of particles. We have sand, which is the largest size particle, silt, which is the medium size, and clay. And the way that these interact together is really important, because that allows us to determine how much water the soil can actually hold. Obviously, the soil in the desert doesn't hold near as much water as in the Northeast, and that's based on temperature, but as well as the structure. But before we get too much into structure, we all got to be talking about the same thing. And so, what I've put the soil texture triangle on here. And so this is the same idea of why we have botanical names on trees. We could all be talking about an oak, and I might be talking about a white oak, and you could be talking about a red oak, and someone else could be talking about a blackjack. But unless we are using specific terminology, we don't actually understand each other. And so this triangle allows us to dissect soils based on the particle size. So if we look at this and we had 20% clay and 40% silt and 40% sand, then we know that we have a loam soil. And if we can all talk about that at the same time, we know that we're talking about the same porosity, we're talking about the same water characteristics, we're talking about we have a point of reference and we compare. And so when people talk about soil, normally if I ask my buddy what kind of soil he has at his house, he'd say, I got red clay, or it's real sandy. But that doesn't actually help us understand what we're actually facing. So this is the same idea as why you get a soil test. We can't fix anything that we don't know about, and we can't know about it if we're not sure what we're speaking to. So the size of the particles is important, because that's what determines pore space. And if we look at this picture in the top right about pore space, this could be any soil, but the size of the particles determines the pore space. If we had a sand, we have really big, huge pores, and water wouldn't. You get a lot of water in there, but you couldn't keep it because it's not adhered very tightly to that soil. Then if we had silt, we had smaller pores, but still pretty big, and water would adhere to them better. And then the smallest one, clay, although it has exponentially more pore space than sand, because they're so small and they're loosely packed together, it holds the water so tight that you actually don't get a lot of water available to the plants out of a pure clay soil. So if we're thinking about how much water we can get out, we kind of want to talk about what the pore space means. So there's three main topics of pore space. If a soil is completely full, all the pore space is full with water, there's no oxygen in the soil, it rained 5 inches a day for the last week, and all the extra water is just running off. That's a completely saturated soil. So there's no water. There's only water in the pore space and no oxygen. This is obviously not drought condition, but it's also not a sustainable state. Soils don't stay saturated unless there's something seriously wrong with them. So then once we have saturated soil, if we had gravity act on it, and then all of the water that will drain out by gravity drains out, that's what we would call field capacity. Field capacity is as much water as the soil can hold against gravity. So any water that comes off, that's gravitational water, which is pretty much purely academic. There's nothing we can use or do with that water. The field capacity is how much the soil can hold on its own. And so the difference between that and then we keep going down a layer is the permanent wilting point. It's named that because that's when the plant can no longer get any more water out of the soil. So when we were talking about the way the plant moves water through the tree, the negative water potential is greatest at the top of the tree. There's less water there than there is in the soil. At some point, that becomes balanced, and that's the permanent wilting point, where there's as much water in both places, and so osmosis ceases to happen because we're at equilibrium. So that's what the permanent wilting point is. There's still water in the soil, but the plant doesn't have access to it, so we call it unavailable water. And so the difference between field potential or field capacity and permanent wilting point, that's really the only water that we're concerned with, because that's the only water that plants can actually use. If you had soil at permanent wilting point, you can get more water out of it but you have to add energy to it, whether that be bake it in an oven, which is what soil scientists do when they study soil, or if you pull a tremendous vacuum on it, you can get more water out of it. Soil's never completely dry, even when it's powdery. There's still water in it, but plants can't access it because they're not using a system that has energy input into it. Next slide, yes. So with that in mind, we never get constant soil texture. Soil texture, whether it be loam or a sandy clay loam or whatever it is, it's never constant. You never have a soil that's all one thing as deep as you want to grow. So where they interact, where we have for shorthand, we'll talk about coarse soil texture and fine soil texture. If we have something that's really coarse, like an over-exaggeration with this would be gravel, and normal rooting soil for fine texture. Where they meet is we'll have an interesting interaction with each other, and this can really play both good and bad effects on us in a drought situation. So what we're talking about there is a perched water table. So this will happen normally whenever you have a coarse layer of soil underneath a fine layer or fine textured soil. But we also do this on purpose, particularly in the sports turf world. If you ever have watched football or golf or baseball when it's raining, at a professional level, you'll notice that there's never any puddles on the field. And the reason that is they've introduced a perched water table. So when you have a fine textured soil, you can have a lot of water held into it, but it is held more tightly in a fine textured soil than it is in a coarse textured. So the gravity will draw out all of the water from the coarse textured soil, but it is being held too tightly in the fine textured soil to come out. So we have more plant available water in the top. So plants can grow, and that's great. But when we get to a saturated point where all of the pores are filled, it drains extremely well because the gravitational water in the coarse textured soil, pulls all of it out. And so a football field will drain 8 inches of rain an hour and never have any puddles on it. But that's good when we have sports turf, we're trying to make that happen. Or if we have a tree, we might want to introduce that if it needs to be a really dry root system, a really dry root zone for them. But the flip side of it, when we have a coarse textured soil over top of a fine textured soil, we end up doing the exact opposite, which is where we get in trouble with drought stress. So if we have a really coarse textured soil over top of a fine one, all the gravitational water drains out of the coarse textured soil, and there's nothing in there for the roots to get because it's not held very tightly to the soil. And so either the plant has to push roots down deeper, which costs a lot of energy, and perhaps it can't even get down there. It depends on how deep the coarse textured layer goes, or you get essentially a man-made drought anytime it doesn't rain constantly. So that could happen in a lot of places, particularly in residential areas where they grade down to a really fine clay, and then they backfill with something that's much coarser, you'll end up getting an inverse perched water table, which can really be something you have to keep an eye out. Some plants always just in Mrs. Jones' yard are always dry. It might be worth taking some soil samples and seeing what you're looking at down there. And you can fix this by adding in more fine textured soil into the coarse layer, because this happens a lot in potted plants where Mrs. Jones will put an inch of gravel in the bottom of a pot and then put soil on top of it, and think they're going to get a lot of drainage out of that. Or you plant a tree and you put an inch or two of gravel in the bottom of the hole for drainage. But if that coarse texture is completely surrounded by fine textured soil, then you've negated the entire principle of a perched water table. So if you're trying to break up an inverse table, then you just continue to add top dressing and do aeration and backfill with other fine textured soil, and that'll get your drainage back to the way it should be. Can you go back one there? Thank you. That's native soil texture, the way that it is when we find it, whether we mess with it or not. But another piece to it is soil compaction. We can artificially make coarse textured soils much more fine by compaction. This is something that we're always fighting, whether it be from backfill in a neighborhood, or someone put a structure and they had cranes driving all over their soil without protection. Compaction makes the pore smaller, and the smaller the pore, although it can hold water, it's held so tightly to the soil that the plants can't get at it. And so when I'm talking about being held tightly to the soil, it's the same principle as xylem and phloem. So we have water's attracted to itself with ionic bonds, and then it's also attracted to the clay particles and the soil particles from surface tension. And so the smaller we make the pores, the more surface tension there is, and the less we can have available for the plants. But where this comes into play in drought stress is we can actually make things that it seems like we're doing good, or the customer, they've been really taking care of their yard, and we'll run into worse than normal drought stress. And this can be through the creation of a hard pan, which basically, if you aerate, whenever you aerate, particularly turf, or anything where you have spines or tubes that go down to the same depth, at the end of that aeration spike, you're compacting the soil. And so if we take a 3-inch core out every time we do this, or just use solid tines to aerate, and they aerate every year, 3 inches down or 5 inches down, or whatever length they always go at, we've created a hard pan. We've compacted that soil, so we'll have potentially an inverse perched water table. We have poor drainage. Roots won't be able to go through it very well, and we can really create more problems than good by, we're thinking we're doing this great thing by introducing air into the soil profile for the turf, but we're really hurting the shrubs and the trees around it. So how we fix that is you want to go at different depths every year if you can, and if you can't, you need to come in every now and then with something that's either creates aeration laterally, like an air spade, where we can go to varying depths and we're fracturing the soil structure horizontally, or just rotate the type of aeration as well as the depth. So if you run into something that, this tree seems like it's really getting hit a lot harder than the rest of the area on drought stress, it might be a good idea to offer an air spading or a deep root fertilization. Not necessarily with fertilizer, but even if we can inject water into the soil profile and fracture it horizontally with just water, then that can help break hard pans and get more pore space into the soil, and more pore, bigger pore space can help with the tree's ability to get moisture as well. So we'll go to the next one. So all of this is based on right plant, right place. And so we need to think about, what kind of stresses these plants are going to be under, how we can mitigate that, and how to fix it. So this photo, this is, pretty good joke here, where whoever planted this thought this palm tree would be great here. This is clearly the right plant for the right place here. And we can actually get a lot of our problems solved by just not making the mistake of putting something that doesn't belong there in the first place. So we're thinking about stress, and what we need to think about is how can we mitigate this? How can we fix it? So some form of stress is not only the drought, where we can mitigate that by adding water or creating the ability for trees to get more water through their own root system, but it's also heat. And heat damage, although not always attached to drought, often is. And so we need to be thinking about how we can fix that as well. If that means that we particularly in urban environments, picking trees that are really drought or really heat tolerant to go in around asphalt. Really good example of this is we always get a lot of red maples planted, at least around me, in parking lots. A red maple's a mid-story forest tree, and it's not used to having that much heat and that much sun on it, and so it might not die, but it's going to suffer, and you often see gloomy scale all over it, and that's because the tree's compromised. Same thing with dogwoods. If you, especially in the deep south, you put a dogwood in the middle of a bright sunny yard, it's going to be more susceptible to drought and heat stress because its native environment is understory trees where it's much shadier. And this is all moving scale here, because up north where it's dry but it's not quite as hot, and you could probably get away with that with a dogwood, but it's really how you are thinking about the native environment of the tree, what it naturally grows in, what stresses it naturally faces, and is this a similar place? This tree makes sense. You would never plant a willow tree in the middle of Arizona, but some people they think that would be a great idea. So on that same thing, we want to be talking about, is it worth it? If Mrs. Jones calls us up and she says, I'm really struggling with drought stress on my willow tree in Arizona. Is it worth your time and theirs to fight a losing battle? You want to make sure that you're actually doing good for what you can, and it's our responsibility to inform the customer that, although this seemed like a great idea when you put it in, this is a terrible plant for this area, and we're gonna, no matter what we do, we're gonna struggle to fight, whether it be drought stress or disease, or the environmental factors are just not conducive for this plant to be here. We should need to change it out or do what we can to make it happen. We also need to be thinking about soil volume, and particularly in the same idea as the urban setting. Do we have enough soil to actually grow this tree for it to be getting the nutrients that it needs, that we're going to have the ability for it to get the water that it needs? Whether if it's in a devil strip where we know that we can't grow a tree here, let's not put it there in the first place and just fight for the entire time to keep it going. And then we also need to think about the soil structure. Do we need to amend this? Do some plants will take compacted soil much better than others. So let's not, if we know that we're in a new residential area where there's tons of compaction because construction just ended, and we don't have the ability, or the customer doesn't want to pay for serious soil amendment, let's put something in that place that will take to sandy soils or take to really compacted soils. Let's not try and put a square peg into a round hole on this one. That's kind of what we had for the, all of that is the tree's native environment as well. And so we're going to take a quick break here, a 10-minute intermission. And if there's any questions that you've submitted to Kale, I'm sure he'll get them to me. And when we come back, we'll talk about fertilizer and specific stress responses and how trees deal with this, and what we can do to actually fix this drought stress issue that we're facing.
You guys ready? Yep.
Just from when I started till now, the advancements in this industry are huge. It's crazy.
Most technological advanced thing we have going for us right now, I think, is the remote control tree removal machines, like the Altec Knuckle Boom. I mean, we can take a tree that would have been a 40-inch ash removal that would take us the better part of a day, maybe a day and a half. We can have 3 of those done before lunch now.
I'm pretty confident that Cena probably saved my life, just being able to talk to the crane operator, say, hey, hold on a minute, don't raise it up so hard, or, just that quick chat back and forth, that instantaneous. 10 years ago, we were doing hand signals and, there's always a delayed reaction, but now it's, as soon as you say something, the other person on the other end of the line can hear you. Everybody knows what's going on. Yeah, it's definitely changed. It's changed a lot.
Even small stuff like integrating everything into Google, you know what I mean? So the Google scheduling and, which is integrated in Google Maps, which is, you can do all the electronic bids through Google Docs.
The equipment just takes so much risk factor out of a lot of the jobs. The climbing gear just makes it easier on the climbers every single day. It's amazing what people have, how far along we've advanced. It lets you stay in this business for a longer period of time.
That's why companies are buying mini loaders and rear mounted elevator buckets and spider lifts and using drones and using all this cool, great technology that we have available to us now.
5 years from now, it's going to be amazing what technology is out there.
Are you ready to Jambo, baby?
So what's going on here is the Jambo claw game.
The claw game is one of the best parts about Jambo.
We got 4 climbing systems here. There's a zigzag, there's an akimbo, there's a Blake's hitch, and there's a rope runner.
And participants will jump up on the pedestal. Jambo Man affixes you into the human claw climbing system. Climbers then take themselves from the pedestal out into the prize pit.
And there's all these boxes laying around on the ground. Grab that box with your feet.
And then they have to use those same 4 climbing systems to navigate back to get that prize back onto the starting pedestal, just like the claw games that you're used to when you were a kid.
If you drop the box doesn't get on the stump, or you touch the ground, tough luck. It's a mystery grab. You don't know what you're gonna get. Could be really cool, could be not so cool, but it's Jambo, so it's probably really cool. Could be rocks, could be cups, could be a chainsaw, could be climbing gear. You open it, see what's inside. I'll come away with something. I don't think you don't really win this game. You just get some cool stuff. I won some clippers, rope bag, a banner. I'll get a box for sure.
Come on, man. Come on, man.
Jambo Man is here the whole time, Robert Albert, and cheering everybody on and helping them through it.
Jambo Man, he's got some energy. He's a great guy. This is pretty fun. It's a different experience. I like, swinging around on ropes and stuff, so I'm kind of excited to try it out.
Now, who's your best friend in the whole wide world? Jambo Man!
So I just played the loader game. It was so much fun. It's articulating in the middle, it's oscillating on the sides, it's tricky, there's tons of buttons, but it's a jam at Jambo.
I've never seen a loader challenge anywhere in any competition that would showcase this set of skills for a person that was not necessarily a climber.
The branch manager grapple is a free-floating grapple. That thing is a lifesaver.
One of the beauties of the articulating loader, or any type of log moving tool, is that you can do it on light duty. There's still an opportunity for a person to be a massive impact on a tree crew now. And I think that's why this skill is so important to recognize as an important asset.
We're going through the obstacle course. You can't break anything, you can't hit the house. You gotta pick up the log, you gotta get up to it, you gotta reverse back, you gotta come back around. It is insane.
The loader game looks really fun. I'm really psyched about it. I really am. It looks fun, and I think it'll be great.
The grapple is the bee's knees. I would love a grapple. Maybe once I get a crane, I would love to save up for one.
I think with the development and innovation of the mini articulating loader, you're going to start seeing more and more of them on tree crews. Everywhere you go, they're pretty affordable.
Most fun at Jambo.
Keep your mouth shut and your ears open. You've got to truly humble yourself every day and realize that one bad decision will be your last if it's the wrong one.
Never stop learning.
Learn and study a good arborist as much as possible. Watch them, watch how they work in a tree.
Get their 2 cents, especially in business. That's been the biggest challenge for me is finding out that a relative degree of skill will not carry me through, that I needed to be diligent as well about the business side of things.
If you haven't already gone to some sort of trade show, competition, whatever, get out and just shake hands with people. You'd be amazing. You'd be amazed how welcoming everybody is and how much they want to be there to help you. It's pretty inspirational.
Don't just take one person's advice, Seek out as much information as you possibly can.
And also realize that it's not a single man sport. This is a team sport. It's a team occupation. And how we interact with each other and how we make each other feel is just as important as how great you can climb and how wonderful you can rake.
You gotta expose yourself to greatness. You don't settle. If you feel like you're gridlocked and you're not learning, move on and go find somewhere where you can learn and grow, So that's probably the best advice I can give. Soak it up like a sponge everywhere you can get it.
It wasn't that scary. It has tubes and ropes that you have to climb up and try to make it to the top and ring the bell.
Gotta use your mind and know what you're doing.
So the first section is kind of like big tubes that you have to stand on and bars that you have to pull yourself up on.
And in the second section, ropes. And in the third section, more ladders. And in the final section, which becomes the funnest part of them all, the ropes, rope bundles. I thought I did pretty good. Probably could have did better, but did the best I could. My arms got tired when I got to the rope bundle. It's fun, that's for sure.
Are you having fun?
Yep.
Hi, I'm Cale Royer, head party animal at TreeStuff.com. I'm here to make sure that everyone knows about our Tree Stuff Party program. Each month, volunteer arborists from different regions host free recreational climbing events powered by TreeStuff.com, giving local arborists a chance to meet, hang out, climb, and try out some cool new gear in the trees. Every Tree Stuff party is 100% free, so there's no reason to not bring your family, friends, co-workers, and acquaintances. Check our Facebook events page to learn about upcoming Tree Stuff parties, and sign up to be notified when there's a new Tree Stuff party in your neck of the woods at treestuff.com/parties. It's all about seeing friends, making new friends, and having fun in the trees. I hope you can make it to a party soon.
All right, we're back. We're gonna dive into fertilizer here if there aren't any questions. And I get that question a lot, actually, about what to apply for fertilizer in the summer. And it's a pretty easy answer, and it's don't apply fertilizer in the summer. It's a bad idea.
I have a question.
Oh, yep.
Real quick. Where do you do your research on what trees go well with which area? So like how hardy a tree is for heat. How would you find that out?
Great question. So there's two scales that people use when they're talking about hardiness. And most people, when they think about the hardiness scale, are thinking about the cold hardiness scale. And it goes from zone 0 to, I think, 14 in A and B increments. So like where I live in Tennessee, I'm zone 7B. And so that gives us the average low temperature for the last 10 years. And so that's how hardy plants are. But they also have another one that gets used a lot less, called the heat hardiness scale. And what that is, it's actually produced by the HVAC industry. And it's a map of the US, and they track how many days over 85 degrees any given location will experience in a year. So like, I don't know what I am here, we recently moved. I'm guessing zone 9 or 10, but up, Nantucket Island or Massachusetts, they're a heat index zone 1. They get almost no days over 85. So you could look at the maps that you can find online to do that, or if you just wanted to find out about trees, I actually have a really good book here. This is my go-to textbook for showing here. For anything tree related, Manual of Woody Landscape Plants by Fred Durr. Or I'm sorry, Michael Durr. I apologize, but it's great. You get in there and it has it's all by botanical name, but it gives you the soil it likes to grow in, how you propagate it, the hardiness zones, anything you could possibly need to know to grow any woody plant can be found in Durr's Manual for Woody Landscape Plants. They did make a new version of this recently that's like highly stylized and has a lot of pictures, which is not near as good as this is the last one. It's ugly, it's brown, and all it is just straight information about hundreds of trees. So I would go and definitely buy one of those. They're kind of pricey, but they're definitely worth it. I was not asking you a question. All right, so we'll jump back into it then. Okay. All right, so when we're talking about fertilizer, The only reason we would ever fertilize, regardless of season, is to give the tree nutrients it can't get normally for it to grow. We'll go over some specific stress responses of trees in the next couple slides. But the headline here is when trees are experiencing drought, the trees want to divert energy from growing shoots and leaves to growing more roots and root hairs, because that's what's going to allow them to keep getting water into their system. On top of that, most all fertilizers are salt based, and when we talk about salt in fertilizers, we're not talking about like table salt, but it's defined as any compound that's formed with a reaction of an acid and a base. So that's what we're talking about, salts. And the reason that the fertilizer companies make their formulations in salts is because they want to have all the nutrients be able to go into a soluble solution. When it hits water, it needs to be able to dissolve and translocate through the soil and be available. So that's why they use salt bases for this. Why that matters is when we add salt to soil, we're doing a couple other things. We're just like if you could think of it as table salt, but we're increasing the osmotic pressure in the soil, which means, we were talking about transpiration where it all works because there's less moisture in the air than there is in the soil. But if we put more salt in the soil, then the water is more tightly attracted to the soil, and so you're essentially pulling water tighter to the soil where the trees won't be able to access it very well. Also, it changes the biome of the tree. So the only way that we can flush anything out, like we always talk about leaching when it comes to pesticides, or fertilizer applications, but this is another thing. Salt is building up in the soil because we know that water generally moves from in the soil to out of the soil, not in the soil down. Because water is evaporating out of the soil, trees are using it, plants are using it, it's moving towards the surface. So the only way that we get leaching is if we get a saturated soil condition, and then the salt goes back into solution and then drains off with the gravitational water. So that's when we get serious fertilizer leaching. But sometimes you can, not advocating this, but if you run into a really high salinity soil, sometimes people will try and do a flush of the soil where they'll saturate the soil and then continue to add water to it. And then the idea is that you're leaching all of the soil salts out of it. You're also taking everything else that can go in the solution with it, but sometimes you might need to do that. Also, if you have a salt buildup, you change the biome. So bacteria, microflora, microfauna have specific pHs and salt ranges they like to live in. And the native soil is the native soil, and it has its native bacteria. But if we introduce a lot of salt into it, then we're changing what likes to grow there, what can grow there, and we get a lot more halophytic organisms, which are salt-loving organisms. And they may or may not be beneficial to the tree. Most of them aren't. Whether they do damage or not, they usually don't, but it's not really known too well. But in any case, we're changing what the tree's grown in, and that's going to cause more stress to the tree. Not only are we going to have drought stress, but we're going to put abiotic stress on it as well. On top of that, when we push plants to grow when they want to be doing something else, it causes health risks. So there's this thing called luxury consumption in trees. Some trees do it, some trees don't. A red maple is a good example of this. They do luxury consumption, which means they'll take up all the available nutrients whether they need it or not, particularly with nitrogen. So if we put more nitrogen in the soil, there's already nitrogen in the tree, so we're having to take up more nutrients and then pushing it to grow, pushing it to use it. Even if it can't use it, then it'll store it somewhere, the tree. And so we're diverting energy that should be going to surviving the drought by putting on roots and root hairs. We're diverting it to something that's not productive, like storing nitrogen or trying to grow a shoot. So we want to try and avoid that whenever we can. Also, if you have salt and these fertilizers going, you can get actual burn, where we're taking all the water out of the plant tissues and causing damage that way. The simplest rebuttal to fertilizing in the summer is that if trees have been planted in the appropriate site, they shouldn't need much extra help. If they're in the soil that they should be in, the pH that they should be in. We've done our soil tests when we planted them, and when we're having a good fertilizer program. When they are consuming nutrients in the spring and the fall, then we won't need to actually try and push them when they don't want to be in the summer. Also, the bigger trees get, the more mature they are. It's been shown that they need less and less fertilizer because they have extensive root systems that can take up the nutrients, and we're not actually doing as much good as we think we are for that. That being said, we can add some stuff to the soil to help out with drought stress. There's a million things out there. One of the things that I've tried personally and actually like is NutriRoot by ArborJet. It has the two main things that we want when we're talking about drought stress. It has humates and humectants. So humates is basically extremely decomposed organic material, and why that's important is it has really fine pore space that isn't when we add that, we can increase the soil holding capacity for water. So the more humid, as well as a plethora of other benefits that organic matter gives to soil, which we'll cover some other time. But basically, why humates are important is the increased pore structure. And humectants, they're more in wetting agents, although they can be in anything. It's an additive that essentially attracts moisture out of the atmosphere and to the soil and holds it in a way that the plants can access it. So sometimes if it was just a humectant, might be called a wetting agent, which there's many different kinds of wetting agents. Some attract moisture, some prevent evaporation. Some are like the the gels that swell with water and then let it out as it gets dry. Although those don't, when they're dry, they're dry. They're not helping you out any. But if you want, most people don't use them in the tree industry because it's so expensive and the labor to put them on is not really worth the benefit that you get. If you had young trees where the root systems weren't that widespread and they can't get the water they need to survive, it would certainly be worth it. If you had a prize tree, Mrs. Jones is paying you a lot of money to keep this tree alive, and we're a tough spot and we can't keep it watered well enough. It might be worth it then, but as a general practice, I don't know how to use it every day. All right. So, stress response. So the stress response is basically the tree trying to save itself. Mother Nature has been working on this for a long time. Trees have been growing without any human interaction for billions of years. And so some of the ways that they get over it or figure it out is wilting, and which we're all aware of is dehydration of cells, and it loses surface pressure. But the cool thing about wilting is that although it's pretty simple, it's been developed that because there's less water in the leaf, the leaves are actually less susceptible to heat damage. So the hotter it is, the more at risk we are for denaturing proteins and killing things through heat, even if they have all the water they need. It's too hot. So a tree is at its highest risk for heat damage when it's fully hydrated. When all the water's in the tree, that's when it runs the risk of being damaged by heat the most. Wilting is the way that the trees will protect itself from that. Often heat and drought are tied together, so that's how that one got connected. Trees will also shift energy away from photosynthesis, away from shoot development, away from leaf development, and put it all into root development, to explore new areas of soil, to explore, just how can it get more water. It wants to do that. And there's one particular hormone that's perhaps the most important in drought stress, which is ADA, which is abscisic acid. It was first found in cotton, where they thought it was responsible, or that it was responsible for leaves falling off, the abscission of leaves, and so it's named. Although now they've figured out that that is not, in fact, its main role, and not all plants use abscisic acid to abscise leaves. But why it's cool is it's like the #1 reason plants can survive drought, because it increases root. Now, all of this happens once the plant senses that it's dry and that it's not getting enough water. As soon as it senses that, it increases ADA production, and ADA will reduce shoot growth, reduce leaf growth, and divert all that energy to lateral roots and root hairs, and try and put on as much absorbing material, i.e. roots, that it can. It'll also, so those stomatas we talked about, when they're fully hydrated, they're open, and when they're not, they close down. Well, a big piece of that not only is the hydration piece, but it's very sensitive to potassium. Potassium helps the stomata cells be more receptive to opening and closing, and ABA really helps out with that sensitivity, and so it will essentially make the stomatas more responsive. On top of which, those are the main things that trees do, but there's also cool things that trees do that go above and beyond this. This picture of this tree in the top right, you may know what it is, but it's a bristlecone pine tree. And why this is so awesome is this is considered one of the oldest living organisms on Earth. They regularly grow to many thousand years old. I think the oldest one's somewhere in the 4,000 or 5,000 year old range. And the way that it's adapted to grow is it grows where there's like no water. It's up in the mountains out west, where there hardly anything grows. But it has come up with a strategy where when it has the advantage of growing, it does that, and then when it gets lean again, it will selectively let pieces of it die. The tree will let a branch die here or a piece of the trunk there. And so that's why you get these gnarled, dead-looking spots in it, because that's exactly it. The tree's decided that to survive, we only have so many resources, and we're going to cordon them off and use them to continue to live. And if a piece of it needs to die, then it will. Other trees will do this, but usually when they start doing this, then the whole thing dies. But this is a really cool tree that you don't see often unless you live out west, but certainly worth mentioning. All right, we'll go on to the next slide there. So I guess this is what we should have been talking about the whole time. What do we do? What do we do for stress? The title was perhaps a bit misleading on the webinar, but what we need to do is we need to think about all of what we learned and apply this in a logical way. So we need to water at appropriate times. Obviously, when we have drought stress, the solution to this is add more water. It's pretty cut and dry. But how we do that and the way we do that will give us the best success. If we could water any time of the day, but if we water in the middle of the day, obviously it's the hottest. You're going to lose a lot of water to evaporation, and we're being wasteful there, and the tree is not in a really good place to absorb it. Obviously, when the temperature cools off, it's not as hot. The stomatas, any water that is being absorbed will open the stomatas at night, and so they'll still be open in the morning often. So if we can water in the evening and the morning, then we'll have the most transpiration going for the day, and that will get the most water into the tree. The stomatas are closed. There's hardly any transpiration going on. It's all evaporation. And so if we don't have that force from the top pulling the water molecules out of the tree, we have nothing drawing them in. And so we need to focus on getting the water into the tree when it wants it, which is early morning and late evening. Also, we want to ensure everything's planted correctly. And this is more of a do the small things right. We want to make sure that we're not fighting a losing battle. We don't have weird soil texture issues that are creating an inability for water to maintain in the root zone. We're not trying to combat really bizarre hard pan, or the soil volume just isn't there where we can't actually grow a tree here. It's pretty straightforward. Is this tree in the right place? Did we plant it correctly? We don't have girdling roots that are keeping absorption from happening. We're giving the tree the best chance it can to do this. We want to apply the correct additives when necessary. We never want to fertilize. We want to make sure that if we are applying something, that it's actually a benefit to the tree. So when we talk about ABA, the trees will grow more roots, which will make them more able to handle drought, and that stays for the next year, and it continues to do this over and over again. Where we can actually get in our own way is if we immediately water heavily all the time and continue to produce or put all this water down for the trees, and they don't feel that stress, and we're doing them a disservice, because they don't produce the root mass they need to produce to continue to live, and we're kneecapping. Whereas if we water smartly, where we give them enough that there's no detriment to the tree, but they're still experiencing stress, they still put out extra roots, every year more and more susceptible to drought than they were the last year. The exception to this, obviously, newly planted trees, small trees that aren't established yet. If you have to plant a tree in a bizarre place, like where there's a lot of heat, it's not gonna help much. But you definitely want to water enough to keep it alive, because otherwise, there's no point in it getting stronger. But you also don't want to baby it so much that you're not actually producing strong trees. And the same fact, watering bags. Whenever we think about watering and irrigation, oftentimes in the same sentence we talk about watering bags. And so something to think about this, because it's hot. Oh, we got to water the trees. We got to make sure that we're doing the right thing. Well, depending on the color of the bag and the size of the bag, you placed a gigantic heat sink around the trunk of the tree. And so, is it worth it? Sometimes it is. I just established a tree. The root zone is not much wider than the watering bag. We need to keep this tree alive, and we can't be there to water it all the time. This is how we need to do it. Then it's certainly worth it. If it's baking in the middle of the sun and we're putting 150-degree water down on the tree, perhaps you'd be better off coming by and watering it by hand if you can, and if not, there's some other options. We could, have the old mulch volcano ring, so more water would sit there. That might be a time for a wetting agent to try and draw as much moisture to it as you can. But you want to make sure that you're not actually hurting the trees by confining the root zones. Again, if we have all this this water right on top of the tree, then it's not sending roots out to new places. It's not developing a strong root system. So we want to make sure that we're focusing all our efforts on growing the best plants that we can. But, all right, we'll go to the next. So that's kind of what we had here for drought stress. I said before, the basic is if it's dry, you should water it and make sure that we're doing not anything negative to the trees and just allowing them to go through their natural cycles. Mother Nature's figured this out, and we just need to make sure that we're not getting in the way. So plants do adapt to heat, whether that's through ABA and more roots, or they wilt to protect themselves from heat damage. That's very important to keep in mind. Water moves in predictable ways, and we want to make sure that we understand that. Kel and I were talking about earlier, if we don't understand how water moves in the soil and how it moves through the tree, there's no way that we can understand drought stress and keeping the water where we want it. So we gotta know what we're talking about and why things are happening to fix them. You want to always choose the right place, the right plant for the right place. And I can't say this enough. This is key to any horticultural endeavor. Let's not fight a battle that we don't need to. If we can put a plant that wants to grow in the area that we want it to grow, then we'll have the best success at it. We can make it happen with other plants, but just know that whether it's disease or drought stress or anything else, if plants don't want to grow there, you're going to struggle to keep them growing there. And then consider what you add to the soil. This is, again, do no harm. Wetting agents are sometimes a great way to go. Sometimes they're not, and we never want to fertilize. But the most important thing you probably add in the soil is water, and we want to do the little things right first. So pick the right tree, get it planted properly, get it established properly, do the right pruning on it in the winter, and just maintain the general health of the tree as long as we can. And as my dog is showing right here, this is the proper way to stay hydrated, and that's really what drought stress is all about: is how can we increase the tree's ability and chance to get water and keep it there as long as we can. So the next one is, I just wanted to say thank you guys for watching, and if you have any questions, certainly we'll take them now. If you think of something later, you can always get me at phc@treestuff.com. And I wanted to give a special thank you to the NC State Horticulture and Turf Departments, as well as Dr. Cooper, for all of the data and the photos in this presentation. All right. I think we got a little technical glitch, but if you have any questions, send them in. And thanks so much. And here's Jake.
Albert, thank you so much for your time tonight. Excellent presentation, and we hope it will help the arborists who watch with a better understanding of caring for trees in this hot weather. Well, be sure to check out our next webinar on September 19th, Redefining Evergreens with Joe Aiken. It's very interesting. He's been working on this topic for quite a while now, and so very miss it. And for our upcoming webinars, head to our events page here on our Facebook page, TreeStuff.com. That's spelled out. We've got some great topics coming up, so make sure you check them out. So for Director Cale Royer and everyone on the TreeStuff team, I'm Jake Miller. Thanks so much for joining us. Albert, thank you so much for your time tonight.